Good afternoon, and in some cases, good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Whiteway, and I am the Executive Director of ERASA, the Regional Settlement and Integration Sector umbrella for Atlantic Canada. I am stepping in today for Debbie Douglas, who was originally going to be chairing this panel, but who unfortunately was unable to. But please don't leave. I will do my best to fill Debbie's very large and competent boots. And besides, you are all in for a highly engaging session focused on what we are all interested in, envisioning immigration and settlement in Canada in a post-pandemic era. I'm joining you today from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I'm grateful for the peace and friendship treaties and recognize the ancestral and continued ties of Indigenous peoples to the lands and waters in the region we know as Atlantic Canada. Though we were not quite there, we hope the post-pandemic era is approaching and immigration will be central to a successful recovery. This session will explore what immigration and settlement are likely or should look like post-pandemic, and what we can do to harness immigration for a prosperous Canadian future. The presenters in this session will not only talk about what we know about immigration and settlement in Canada now, and what we have learned during the pandemic, but will be creative in anticipating what future policies and programs in Canada could look like to optimize the benefits for newcomers and established Canadians alike. We're going to hear about things we've learned in terms of adaptations and innovations in settlement services from David Cashaback from IRCC. And of course, one of the key things we've had to navigate is an increasingly online world. Kathy Sherrill from ISS of BC will reflect on how we might navigate a new path in a hybrid world of immigration and settlement services. Patricia Rose from Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation will help us explore from a policy perspective one of the most critical issues facing newcomers to Canada, that is housing. And finally, Keith Newman from Envisioning Institute is going to walk us through some interesting polling data that asks the question of whether Canada's success as an immigrant nation can last. I would like to remind you all that you can submit questions via the right-hand column of your screen, and you can also vote on questions you are interested in. I encourage you to do this at any time during the presentations, but questions will be addressed after all the speakers have finished. So we're going to start with Keith today. Keith Newman is Senior Associate with the Envisioning Institute for Survey Research, a nonprofit research organization that conducts innovative public opinion and social research about Canada and Canadians. His work includes groundbreaking research in such areas as immigration and refugee resettlement, race relations, social capital, and the environment. And he has conducted landmark studies with important but poorly understood communities, including urban Indigenous peoples, Muslims, and refugees from Syria. We're delighted that you can be with us today. So right over to you, Keith.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you all for tuning in today. In the few minutes that I have, I'd like to take a big picture view of immigration and settlement in Canada as it is today and where it may be heading, as Carolyn indicated. And I'd like to take the perspective of Canadians as a whole. We as a people make of our immigrant nation and what we're prepared to support. So here is where I'd like to get started. Obviously, there are many challenges and setbacks which we're experiencing in immigration and settlement. All of you are well familiar with that. But at a broad level, we're doing pretty well. Not everybody in this country is on the same page, as you know. But I would argue that we have passed a critical threshold in this country in terms of acceptance of our immigration experience in terms of our norms, our political discourse, and public policy. And I think our recent federal election was just the latest litmus test of the fact that this is in many ways not one of the critical dividing points in our country. Those of you that were at the P2P conference 2 years ago will remember that I made exactly the same point following the election that took place then. So we really, in a sense, stand out among Western nations in providing fairly little space for anti-immigrant political movements. Just one bit of data to show you from Gallup, the Gallup World Poll on what they call migrant acceptance. They measure this across the OECD, and in their latest research, Canada is at the top of the list in terms of the public, the citizens accepting the immigrants and diversity that we have. So where do we stand today in terms of the pandemic environment? Obviously, this COVID-19 pandemic has created unprecedented disruption. We don't need to dwell on that. And hopefully we're now past the worst of this. So the question I think that some of us may be asking is, how has this affected our collective capacity to be open to newcomers? Has the pandemic made any significant changes that we need to be worried about? Not on the ground in terms of the practical issues, but in terms of where public opinion stands. And what I'd like to do is go through some public opinion data, some research that from our ongoing work to give you a perspective of where Canadians are today. And I would maybe position this as just one way of, as Sylvie said, listening to other stories. In this case, we're scaling up the stories to the population and listening to the stories of many Canadians through our research. Is there too much immigration happening in this country? Environment has been asking this question since the late 1970s, and we've asked it on a regular basis by asking people whether they agree or disagree to this question. There is too much immigration in Canada. Do you agree or disagree? And without spending much time on this slide, which many of you have seen previous iterations of, over the last 15 or 20 years, the majority of Canadians have rejected this premise fairly firmly. And what's important is that has held firm over the past 12 months. A tiny bit of a downtick, but really not something that's significant. And part of the reason for this is that the support for immigration levels is in many ways because most Canadians see or believe or acknowledge or recognize that immigration and settlement is good for the economy and jobs. This slide shows that 80% or more have agreed with this statement for a number of years. Again, a bit of a uptick or downtick in the last year, but certainly not something that suggests a trend at this point. What about refugees? Question again, in this case, we've tracked for since 1987. And the question is, do you agree or disagree? Many refugees claimants are not legitimate. Well, the cynicism behind the sentiment, as you can see on the slide, has been declining fairly steadily over the past number of years. And most recently, and this is data from a September survey, so it's fairly recent, almost the majority reject this sentiment and statement. And the number of Canadians who agree with this statement at 34% is the lowest it's been since we started tracking this. The most common concern that Canadians have is about integration of newcomers. And when people think about this and they're concerned, it's often certain types of immigrants that they're concerned about. So here's data from another one of our survey questions that we've been asking since 1993. And it shows that Canadians are pretty evenly divided in terms of whether they think too many immigrants do not adopt Canadian values. Again, we can see over the past 12 months, there's been relatively little change in this. Things have been fairly steady. And from another survey, this one from 2016, which was conducted with Muslims and other Canadians, I think it's worth showing that we asked a question asking people on the survey what were the important values that immigrants to Canada need to adopt. And the basic message coming out of this results is that Muslims and non-Muslims are in agreement about what people need to do when they come here. And I show this slide partly because this is not what many non-Muslim Canadians would expect. I think there are concerns that newcomers come with different agendas and values. And what many of us know on the ground, but which is still being learned, is that is not necessarily the case. But I guess the support for immigration settlement goes beyond sort of the economic benefits. Here's results from our September survey that basically show that Canadians increasingly see multiculturalism and diversity and inclusion as the thing that makes our country unique. It's the thing to be celebrated, ahead of things like our geography or our political system or our democracy or our freedom. That increasingly it's multiculturalism, diversity, the people that come, and so forth, is what makes this country special. So I think it's important to see that this, again, is not the view of everybody, but increasingly is becoming the case. And our research also shows that there's broad acceptance for accepting refugees from conflict zones. Here's a slide showing results from a 2016 survey asking about the number of Syrians being accepted in that year. And more recently, this fall, in terms of accepting the number of Afghans into this country. And what we can see is that Canadians are most likely to look at the numbers that the government has selected and saying this is about right. And in the case of Afghans in particular, other Canadians are more likely to say these are too few to bring in versus too many. So I'll note that this question was asked before the refugee quota went from 20,000 to 40,000. I expect that if we had asked the question with 40,000, we would have gotten even stronger support for that number. We know that many Canadians have stepped up to privately sponsor refugees, but the potential for this has clearly yet to be tapped. This slide shows results from another survey that we conducted earlier this year with Canadians across the country, which shows that a significant number of them, 17% of the population, would be open to being a private sponsor or participating in this private sponsor group. This translates into 4 million Canadians across the country who would be prepared to at least consider stepping up for this, act in this role. And what about the experience of the refugees themselves? Here are results from an in-depth survey of Syrian refugees, which we conducted in the past year or so. These were with refugees across the country that arrived in the 2015-2016 period. This question, we asked them how they feel about their lives in Canada after being here for a few years. As we can see, most of them are generally, if not very positive, about living in Canada overall. Another result from the survey, most feel welcomed, at least to some extent, by others in their community. This is other Canadians in the places where they're living. And notably, these refugees feel very strongly connected to Canada, a very strong connection, and in fact, more likely to be feeling connected to Canada to their ethnic or cultural group. So, there may be various reasons, but I think that it's important to listen to the stories of refugees, and this research does suggest that there's a lot that they are finding that is very positive. So let's move to the future. The evidence of success we've seen in this research, can it be sustained over time? And I think that there's a basis for optimism. And I would look to see this based on 4 particular factors or reasons: population and economic imperatives, demographic trends and social dynamics, the political landscape, and social attitudes and values. So I want to finish my presentation by covering some of this to give some indication of where I think we're headed. First of all, I think we all understand that the population is changing and the number of foreign-born citizens is continuing to climb. These numbers are from Statistics Canada and probably need to be updated. And we know that this will continue. We are gradually transforming ourselves into the most ethnically diverse country on the planet. And it's unlikely that this is going to change. And you may also know that almost all of our population growth is taking place either with the influx of visible minority populations, and again, that's the Statistics Canada lingo, which I think they are probably trying to figure out how to change, or our Indigenous population. So those are the parts of our population that are growing most significantly, and that's how our population is changing. And here's data that's actually now out of date because it's 5 years old, but the point remains that in the major cities in our country where most of us live, first or second generation, a significant proportion are first or second generation. 42% in Canada overall, 78% in Toronto, 42% in London. And again, these numbers are out of date. In the next number of months, we will see results from the 2021 census, and we'll have to update the slide, and these numbers will be even larger. And of course, we're all hearing about it and maybe experiencing labor shortages in many sectors. Canada needs newcomers and immigrants to fill essential jobs. And that is a sort of a bottom line kind of requirement that can't exactly be ignored. If we switch to politics, I think the point I'd like to make with this slide is that we are not, by and large, a divided country politically, as is the case in other places that we know. And we're certainly not divided on the issue of immigration anywhere like some other places which have large influxes. What the slide shows is that voters in each of the three main parties place themselves in the center of political ideology, neither left nor right. Whether you're liberal, NDP, or conservative, the balance shifts one way or another, but most are in the middle. And I'm not showing results for People's Party voters, but we know from our research that immigration is not the primary issue that leads them to vote for their party. In the last election, it was much more about vaccines and pandemic restrictions. And this political centrism extends across regions of the country. While there are many differences across regions, and certainly there are political battles and all kinds of tensions from east and west and Quebec and so forth, in terms of political ideology, we're all pretty much in the same place. And looking very quickly at social values, this is from the Envisioning Social Values Research, going on for about 40 years. In broad terms, the social values of Canadians, taken as a whole, are evolving slowly in a progressive direction towards what we describe as freedom and autonomy. And as you can see, the US trajectory is somewhat different. It's moving in a different direction. Very quickly on race relations, I'll touch on this because we released a major research project on this last week. I'm showing you a slide that basically shows two things. The first is that a majority of Canadians believe that people in this country from different races generally get along, as opposed to not. And this result is evident even across major racial groups, whether South Asian or Chinese or Black or Indigenous, to more or less degree. So that race relations, in a sense, is not a major fault line the way it is in the US and some other countries. The second point the slide shows is that the Canadians are a little less likely to believe that today than they were 2 years ago. And what we're seeing in our research is that there's an increasing awareness, acknowledgement, and recognition of racism and systemic racism in our society. And that this increased awareness is happening not just among racialized people, but by non-racialized people. There is a bit of an awakening that's going on that I think could be argued would be very constructive. Finally, from another survey that we conducted a couple of years ago with Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth, basically showing that there is optimism in our younger generation about making progress towards reconciliation. Indigenous youth are actually more likely than non-Indigenous youth to be very optimistic. And I think it's pretty important because it's our younger generations who will be the leaders coming over the next couple of decades. So let me finish with just a few final concluding thoughts. As is evident from your own experience and many of the other sessions in this conference so far, there's no room for complacency. Despite the positive aspects of what we're seeing in this research, the problems and challenges in the ground are real. And you all know that better than I do. But I would urge you to also keep the bigger picture in mind. to balance against the negativity that so much pervades our public discourse and can often distort our perspective. We kind of know that, but it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that there's such a negative tint to a lot of what is talked about and emphasizes, and we lose track of the positive aspects of progress. I think the most important point to emphasize is that what we're laboring to build in Canada collectively is something that's really new. A diverse, inclusive society with racial, economic, ethnic, and social equality and justice. This never existed in Canada before, hasn't existed anywhere else. And so we are creating a brand new model for which there's no clear blueprint. And I think this obviously is something that's going to take a lot of time to achieve. But I think it's important to recognize the enormity of what we're trying to accomplish and perhaps to appreciate what we have accomplished so far. With that, I will end the presentation. Thank you, and turn it back over to Carolyn.
Super. Thank you so much, Keith. And as we know, data tells a story. And as we heard from Sylvie in her keynote earlier today, stories are important, and we need to ask ourselves, what are the stories that drive us? So it's certainly encouraging to hear that there is some optimism in the story that this polling tells. But as you pointed out, important to remind ourselves that there's no room for complacency when working towards building a diverse, inclusive society. So next up, we're going to hear from Patricia Rose. Patricia is Vice President Policy at the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. She joined CMHC in 2009 and has held positions in strategic policy coordination, housing finance policy, and federal, provincial, territorial relations. Patricia has also played a lead role in the development of Canada's first ever national housing strategy. So thank you for sharing with us your work in this very important area today, Patricia. I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and I really appreciate being here today with you. I'm joining you from Ottawa, the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. As an immigrant to Canada myself from the Netherlands, I continue to be very committed and continue to be on this learning journey around the history of Indigenous peoples on this land. So I'm going to spend some time with you to talk about federal housing policy, but also the research and data and what it shows us around housing, particularly for newcomers. For the benefit of the audience who may not be as familiar with Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, or CMHC, let me talk to you a bit about the background and what we do. So we are an arm of government and a crown corporation responsible to Parliament through a newly established minister. It's Minister Hussein, who was responsible under the previous government for Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and is now Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion. And of course, very timely considering what's happening in the housing market. So as CMHC and as Canada's National Housing Agency, we contribute to housing affordability and ensuring that we maintain really a stable housing system. And we support Canadians mostly by providing funding for research, for market insights, and specifically for the development and redevelopment of housing projects across the country. And much of that is done either directly by CMHC or through our provincial or territorial partners. We've also set a corporate aspiration for ourselves, quite an ambitious one, that's really driving all of what we do within CMHC in terms of our activities, which is to ensure that by 2030, everyone in Canada has a home that they can afford and that meets their needs. So it's very focused on everyone in Canada. As was alluded to, the National Housing Strategy is an important and first strategy for Canada that we deliver CMHC on behalf of the federal government and working very closely with many players in the housing sector. So I will jump to the slide number 4 to talk a bit about just Canada's housing system. We often talk about the housing system as a continuum of housing needs and a continuum of housing options. And that really spans from shelters to transitional and supportive housing to community or social housing and rental and home ownership. Most of the housing stock in Canada is privately owned, either by the private sector, nonprofits, cooperative sector, with a fairly small portion of the stock owned publicly, mostly by provinces and territories or municipal entities. And housing is so very tied to many social systems, economically, financially as well. We very much see housing as fundamental to a human rights-based approach to ensure really that people, that we put the needs of individuals first and ensuring that they have that housing that is so needed to promote economic stability, to promote social well-being, and promote sustainability as well. Now, when we talk about housing, we've all seen what's been happening in the housing markets. Really, there's been issues and housing concerns that we've been tracking and responding to for a very long time. But in particular, over the last few years, we're seeing that housing prices and rents continue to go up. And while we're seeing those prices and rents go up, we're not seeing incomes keeping pace. And we're not seeing supply keeping pace. And so, of course, that's a dynamic that's impacting a lot of people in Canada. A lot of that demand is being driven by population growth and a significant amount through immigration as well. And then, of course, there are other factors such as very low interest rates, very favorable tax structures for homeowners. We also have speculative behavior in the market. So a lot of factors that are going on that are driving up demands while we're not seeing supply keep up. And there's a number of reasons why we're not seeing supply keep up. One of those are geographical constraints, where certain cities cannot continue to build out, and they will have to build up. But in order to build up or to intensify, zoning and local regulations need to be adjusted to allow for additional development to take place. We're also seeing high building costs that I'm sure many of you have heard about, supply chain issues that's impacting housing. And then there is what we often call NIMBYism, not in my backyard, when it comes to local opposition to increasing or adding housing in a community, in particular when it relates to housing for newcomers, refugees, shelters, etc. So these are barriers that are important for us to be aware of, so we can address those or enable others to address those. And just a few charts here to back up what I've been talking about. So strong demand, yet when it comes to housing starts, we don't see as much of an increase to keep up with that demand. Similarly, when we can compare ourselves to other countries, we're really lagging in terms of the number of dwellings that we have per capita. So the red here indicates Canada. When we have housing demand that's not being met, it has direct implications. It has implications economically and socially, which also has implications for newcomers to our country. So it erodes economic growth. We know that high housing costs reduces productivity. It becomes more difficult to attract and retain employees. It also displaces the population groups out of particular communities where they can no longer live in the community that they serve. It continues to drive inequality between renters and owners, between sort of the haves and the have-nots. And there is an environmental impact as well, especially when there is a push out to out of particular cities to build up other areas, and that has climate impacts, of course. So from any perspective, housing, when we're seeing housing demand not being met, it has some significant impacts that go much broader than that. We have a measure that we've had in place for a number of decades that really goes into how many households are in core housing need. And core housing need is defined based on a number of standards. There's standards around affordability. So what can a household actually afford? And there is a threshold of 30% in place where we're saying a household should not be paying more than 30% of their gross income on the cost of shelter. There's also a standard in place around adequacy. So not only should the housing be affordable, it should also be of a particular condition, so that the physical condition is there. And then there is an element of suitability, which very much applies to immigrants, refugees, where we know that the typically households are quite large. And so there's an element of suitability where there is a measure of bedrooms to household composition. So all of those factors are wrapped up in core housing need. And so overall in the country, there's over 12% of households in core housing needs, but those numbers are quite a bit higher when you look at particular population groups. So there's certain population groups that are overrepresented in core housing needs, and that includes renters, newcomers, Indigenous peoples, and seniors. And I'll dive into that a bit more for newcomers and in particular. So when we look at core housing needs for newcomers and visible minority households as well, those numbers are quite a bit higher. And you see some of the numbers here. Recent refugees, almost 50%, so almost half, are faced with core housing needs. And core housing need is mostly driven by affordability, so a lack of affordability. Other recent immigrants, we see almost a quarter, so quite significant, versus under 11% for non-immigrants. So those numbers are quite staggering when you actually look at breaking down these figures by population groups and how high the incidence is of core housing needs. When we look at that a little bit further, what is encouraging to see is that the incidence of core housing need does go down after time. So with time, it does go down, both for refugees and other immigrants as well, but it does continue to hover at a larger percentage compared to other population groups. So it's a positive that it goes down, but it continues to be quite a bit higher. When we then look at home ownership rates, we also see that over time, while newcomers tend to be in core housing need at a higher incidence, they also move out of core housing need and into home ownership at a quicker pace. And that's something that this chart in particular that it shows. So within CMHC, we set federal policy, and we have particular programs to support housing, but we also have a big role in research and in data, and enable research so that we have further insights into what are some of the needs and the housing conditions of different population groups, so that we can not only inform federal housing policy, but also have information that can inform other decision makers and other groups in the community across the country. So I'll highlight a number of findings from that research for you. So access to suitable and affordable housing is I suppose a given, but it's very critical to the integration of newcomers. And we heard we just heard some of that in insights around integration. So very critical to ensure that they're suitable and affordable housing. As I mentioned before, we do see immigrants moving into home ownership or moving out of core housing needs. So that is a positive dynamic. We do see housing outcomes tied to the admission category and other factors. So when we look at refugees, for example, they experience the least improvement compared to other types of immigrants. So that is, those are some important findings, so that various levels of government, various groups can consider what we need to do to continue to support different population groups and different immigrants. One of the key challenges and barriers to newcomers in accessing housing, the biggest one, as I mentioned, affordability, especially since we do see a lot of newcomers settle in large cities. So think about Toronto, Vancouver, what's been happening with house prices there, both rents and purchase prices. Very expensive cities to live, so very difficult to achieve affordability and ensure that these households also have the funds available to address other basic needs beyond housing. Overcrowding, hidden homelessness, very much challenges that we're seeing, common experience among many newcomers. And that, of course, when it's hidden homelessness, it becomes when they're couch serving or staying with other relatives or friends, it becomes really difficult to track and to have good data on that. Discrimination is something that the research has also shown that is particularly newcomers from racialized groups are experiencing in rental housing markets. And then a disconnect from services that are available for newcomers. So these are some of the findings that that have been coming out of research that we have either conducted ourselves, or we often provide funding to for academics and other groups to provide this research, so that we inform others of these kinds of findings. So what we have done as a federal government around federal housing policy is a national housing strategy that was launched in 2017, with first programs launched in 2018. So this was the first national housing strategy for Canada. We've had housing programs and support for social housing and support for provinces and territories in the past, but this was really a renewed commitment with additional funds to meet housing needs of Canadians. So it's $72 billion. It's a large amount. It includes the value of loans. So this is not just contributions. There is some significant loan programs to enable the construction of projects. And this also includes funding that provinces and territories cost match for us. The National Housing Strategy and the programs that have been developed through there are based on three key principles. People, we need to put people and their housing needs first. Communities, speaking to the fact that housing is very much integrated in community and needs to be connected to other services and amenities, and partnerships. Housing is complex. Housing is capital intense. There is shared jurisdictions among different orders of government. There is a need for wraparound supports and services. So very much partnerships is a it's a cornerstone really of the National Housing Strategy. We do take a human rights-based approach to housing and prioritize people who are made vulnerable. And that very much includes recent immigrants, including refugees. So those are one of the groups that are being prioritized. Funding that is delivered by the federal government or by provinces and territories is supporting in a number of different ways. So one is to create new housing. We need more supply, as I spoke to earlier, to meet the demands. There's a real need to also ensure that the existing supply stays up to date. So there's a real component to modernize, repair housing. There is a stream of funding to do community capacity building of housing providers, and then data, innovation, and research. So to continue to understand housing needs, housing conditions, to continue to experiment with innovative ideas to address the diverse housing needs, as well as affordability support. So just to bring it back to what we're talking about now. So the housing needs of newcomers and refugees are very much recognized as a significant need within Canada. And so increasing the supply of housing, enabling housing providers, enabling developers with financing, with funding to ensure that we build more housing, we maintain the existing stock is very much a priority to ensure that the needs of individuals are put first. I think one thing I want to put out there is that the needs of newcomers and refugees with multi-generational, often multi-generational housing interventions that are needed, as well as large families coming in. While CMHC enables the housing developers and housing providers to build homes that are meeting those needs, more might need to happen to ensure that indeed gets built. So I'll just highlight very quickly a few projects, because I know I'm out of time, that are doing this additional research to really understand housing needs of immigrants, and to come together with community groups to continue to really understand the barriers and the opportunities. So we have a number of solutions labs that look specifically at the housing needs of new immigrants. What are their needs? How do we overcome barriers around discrimination? So there's 2 solutions labs. We have some interesting resources on our website as well, so that we can continue to ensure that those housing needs are met, and that we get people settled, give them a stable home so that kids can start going to school and get integrated into the community as well. So I'll leave it at that. And once again, thank you so much for the opportunity to share that, and look forward to the other presentations.
Thank you, Patricia. What a tremendous aspiration that everyone in Canada has a home they can afford and that meets their needs. And I'm happy to hear that taking a human rights-based approach is the orientation of CMHC. Thanks for helping us break down the issue. I'm sure that there will be lots of questions for you from the audience during our Q&A period. I'm going to now move along, though, to our next presenter. I'd like to extend a big welcome from one coast to another to Kathy Sherrell from ISS of BC. Kathy is the Director of Settlement Services there and has taken a lead role in program development and evaluation, contract negotiations and oversight, and quality assurance and standardization. She's passionate about refugee resettlement, promoting policy change, and a greater understanding of refugee issues. So, Kathy, I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thanks to everyone for joining this morning. It's morning where I am, it's afternoon elsewhere. This morning I'm speaking from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Coquitlam Nations. And it's important that the land acknowledgement for me is more than just words. It's about publicly reaffirming my commitment to the journey of truth and reconciliation, to learning, to reading, to listening, and to committing to change. We stand at a unique point in history, at least history in my lifetime in Canada. We've come out of a period of significant transformation that has arisen owing to COVID-19, facing both this post-pandemic world and on the cusp of increased numbers of arrivals of over 400,000 newcomers per year. So over the next 10 to 14 minutes, I want to highlight 5 emerging issues I think we need to consider as we look forward and embark on this immigration, settlement, and integration in a post-pandemic era. First, the importance of digital literacy and access cannot be understated, and it'll require new approaches and partnerships. The public health orders that imposed lockdowns, shuttered offices, government ministries, and schools alike underscored the need for access to timely and accurate information. For many of our clients who experienced almost immediate job loss or layoffs, the individuals who were now restricted from moving outside, access to information was important, and daily briefings, both federally and provincially, introduced new restrictions as well as financial programs. Those with access to technology and digital literacy could obtain the much needed information and supports. It also allowed them to participate in online learning and remote service delivery. But what about those who didn't have access to technology, or who live in overcrowded homes and share one device among multiple family members? Who gets priority in that situation? And what are the consequences for those without access? What about those, like seniors, who may fear technology or believe they're too old to learn? Access to technology can no longer be seen as a luxury. Yet, for many new and low-income newcomers and Canadians more broadly, the cost of internet access and technology may be out of reach, particularly given high housing costs in many Canadian cities. Over the short term, we need to look to new partnerships with organizations like TELUS, whose Mobility for Good program provides newly arrived government-assisted refugees, youth aging out of care, and other vulnerable groups with access to refurbished cell phones and low-cost internet and mobility programs. Over the longer term, we need government action on the high cost of communications in Canada and ensuring that all communities, particularly those in smaller and remote communities, have access to high-speed internet to get the information they need. Over the last few months, recognizing the importance of technology in this new environment, the Government of Canada has provided laptops or tablets to government-assisted refugees who have arrived through the Afghan Special Initiative and are initially destined and staying in hotels. On the one hand, this has allowed newly arrived individuals to access necessary supports and services during quarantine, but it's raised serious questions about equity. Currently, the tablets are only provided to Afghan GARs, and frankly, under the spirit of equity, moving forward, we need to expand this initiative to include all newly arrived government-assisted refugees, as these are among the most vulnerable individuals coming to Canada, individuals who have been forced to flee and often bring little, if anything, with them. But we also have to realize that access to technology does not mean everyone has the same access to information within households. In our experience, we were providing orientation to individuals in hotel rooms, and at their request and to recognize the privacy and ensure privacy for their family members who were also in the room, many of our sessions were conducted without video. And this also allowed us to accommodate mixed or gender groups. But later what we learned is that many of the female spouses had not actually participated in these initial orientations. So we had to provide the same information and services again out of quarantine to ensure that people understood what they were signing and had an equitable start in Canada. Looking forward, we need to start thinking about what can be done to start the digital literacy skill building process during pre-departure periods. And we can't forget youth newcomers who enter Canada and the sphere of social media and peer engagement through multiple social media platforms, but who may not have the critical skills having come from areas with little or no access or understanding. Second, we need to remember that one approach doesn't fit all. On the surface, online services have the promise to be a more cost-effective service delivery model. It erases geography. It lets us provide services anywhere to anyone. But as a geographer, I think it's important to remind everyone online can't be a substitute for in-person, locally based services. Geography matters. Laws, policies, employment standards, government systems differ across provinces, across regions, and at the local level. Meeting diverse client needs as we look to the future will require an array of both programs and service delivery formats. Whether we're talking about programs like Access Employment's Virtual Employment and Research Attendant, which allows individuals with digital literacy to access pre-employment and in Canada support to online users who are looking for jobs, to in-person case management and accompaniment for the most vulnerable of clients who may lack the knowledge and tools necessary for online services and supports. Online services are not a substitute. They're another tool, and they provide increased flexibility to allow client services at different times of the day, different days of the week, and access to new populations. That said, we cannot blindly continue down the pathway of hybrid service delivery without critically assessing it as a service delivery model. In March 2020, in a matter of days, the settlement sector transformed from in-person to remote service delivery as a predominant service delivery model. Was there online services before then? Yes, but they were limited in number and functioned as a complementary service. In the immediate days, staff reached out to clients any way they could, whether it was email, text message, phone, to assess immediate needs and understand digital literacy. Over time, we began to develop tools and introduce services to promote digital literacy among clients. We used multilingual videos, development and translation of curriculum focused on key tools like Zoom, Telegram, webinars, and as the pandemic progressed, the introduction of new positions like digital navigators who provide one-to-one and group supports to promote digital literacy. But as offices have begun to more fully open to in-person individual and group services, the discussion has transitioned to one of hybrid service delivery as the new normal. Before we go any farther, we need to pause and to evaluate the efficacy of online service delivery, critically asking ourselves what services and supports may be best provided in person versus online, and for which newcomers. Certainly in some populations, we've seen increases, quite noticeable increases in participation as online workshops have removed barriers to participation that had previously been introduced by both travel and childcare responsibilities. But does providing services mean that we've succeeded? Has everybody who required services been able to access them? Who's been left out? And what are the consequences moving forward of our service delivery choices? Within the hybrid sessions, do outcomes differ for those who participate online versus those who participate in person? And we need to revisit outcomes measurement. How do we measure understanding, change in knowledge, behavior when clients are not in person, or if cameras are off, they're not visible? What tools or approaches do we need to put in place? Fourth, we need to invest in a healthy settlement sector to ensure that agencies and staff have the supports they need to meet increased needs and diverse program delivery models. The rapid shift to online service delivery has exposed inequities in digital literacy both within and between agencies. There was no time to plan, procure sufficient technology, whether that was laptops or cell phones, to build necessary competencies among staff, or to pilot online services. We reacted because we had to. We pivoted to Zoom, Telegram, Teams, and a host of other tools to deliver services, often without prior knowledge or experience using these services or delivering services through them. Staff learned new tools and approaches as they went. New competencies such as online teaching. We've seen this emerge across the country as we adapt to not being able to see individuals, not being able to read the body language, not being able to help people, to lean over to help people navigate online services, online applications. These are very different needs, and we had no time to develop them. Providing online services to meet the needs of clients moving forward is going to require investment in short and long term in the tools and skills necessary to build and provide hybrid services. It's also raised important questions about how to maintain client confidentiality when working from home in the presence of other family members. And this was particularly evident during the early days of the lockdowns. We needed to find ways to safely share confidential information like unique client identifiers, documents, while allowing people to, our staff, to be able to verify eligibility. And we need to pay attention to the mental health and well-being of settlement staff across the country. As people's homes and workplaces have merged, access to technology and remote service delivery has increased the client pressures on staff to respond to clients 24/7, particularly for staff who are in and of the community, who are accessing and communicating with their family, both in Canada and overseas, using the very tools we use at work, Teams, or sorry, not Teams, Telegram, WhatsApp. We've seen a lot more pressure on staff to be able to meet client needs. This comes at a time when anecdotally we're hearing agencies are struggling to recruit and onboard new staff, which places further risk of burnout for existing staff. Settlement services are the front line of Canada's immigration and settlement systems, and we need to take this seriously if we're to continue to provide those services to newly arrived immigrants and refugees. As we envision immigrant and settlement post-pandemic, we need to stop and rethink what integration looks like. Too often, program evaluations and research findings reinforce a unidirectional understanding of integration defined by experts and imposed upon refugees and other newcomers. Integration is measured as having obtained employment, bought a home, learned the language. We have an opportunity to stop and to develop an immigrant and refugee-informed definition of integration, understanding that with the diversity of people coming to Canada, integration will look different for different people. If we're going to live up to Canada's aspiration of a two-way model of integration, we have to take up the challenge that was laid out by Hinya, Korn, and Tao in 2016, and followed up by Hinya and Heinemann in 2016, to move beyond an approach that places the onus for integration on newcomers themselves. We need to instead ask, what must the Canadian state, civil society, and the settlement sector provide to allow newcomers to participate fully in Canada? And as I close, finally, immigration is about nation building. Immigration and settlement in a post-pandemic Canada must be informed and guided by a commitment to truth and reconciliation. As the original host society, Indigenous peoples must be a partner in the journey forward. The time is now to reflect and move forward in concrete ways, both pre and post-arrival phases, to increase the awareness of newcomers to Canada's Indigenous peoples, while beginning a process of indigenizing and decolonizing our agency's policies. This means acknowledging difficult truths and grappling with questions about what an Indigenous-informed settlement services look like. And as we look to welcome over 400,000 newcomers to Canada per year, we need to work together in an all-of-society approach that collectively builds the Canada of the future that all of us would like to see. And with that, thank you, and I'll turn it back to you, Carolyn.
Thank you so much, Kathy. There's a lot of territory to cover there, but thanks for providing us with a snapshot of some of the issues that I think have become further exposed during COVID and some of the key recommendations necessary as we move forward. It's a good reminder of the need to remain critical of the way that we provide settlement services, always keeping in mind how we're meeting client needs, but as well the health of the agencies and the staff that serve them. I realize we're getting pretty close to our time, and I'm hoping that we're going to have an opportunity so that at least one question for each of our presenters gets in there today. But our final presenter right now is David Cashaback, and then we'll turn it over to those questions. David is the Senior Director of Horizontal Policies and Programs within the Settlement and Integration Policy branch of IRCC. Prior to joining the branch in August of 2020, he worked in several policy areas at IRCC. And I'm just going to turn it right over to you now, David.
All right, thanks very much for that. And I'm just sharing the screen so folks can follow along. So Carolyn, I'll do my best. I'll do my best and get us through this some time. So listen, thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to my fellow panelists for what's been really interesting, and I hope for folks around the country as well. I'll start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from Ottawa as well, from the traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So what I'm going to cover, and I'm going to probably go a bit faster than I planned, is really give you a sense of a bit of the where we started, right? If it's around where are we going post-pandemic, where did we start right before the pandemic with the settlement program? What have been some of the impacts? And I think Kathy's shared quite a few of them with us already. So that's going to give me a bit of an opportunity to jump into some of the lessons learned and some of the efforts and the reflections, I think. And Kathy, you've given us a good sense of a lot of the questions that we are asking, that we need to ask ourselves collectively around how do we improve outcomes and service delivery. So I'm going to quickly, really, I mean, I don't know that I have to say this to a group like P2P and folks that are participating, but really to reassert like the importance, the essential part that settlement plays in the immigration continuum in Canada. Keith's data sort of shows that it is foundational, and we see that as the immigration and its ambition has grown over the years, so has the scope and the footprint of the settlement program. When we look at the CFP Call for Proposals 2019, that was the largest in the program's history. And some of the things that we tried to do through CFP 2019 was, and I share here this slide around some of the core CORE principles that sort of guided a lot of the efforts to think through and make sure that programming is more outcomes driven and client centered. So you sort of go through each of those principles in terms of the tailoring through the client centeredness, tailoring to meet specific client needs, and outcomes driven, really trying to and looking to ensuring the best outcomes and understanding. And Kathy asked this question as well. So what are we learning, and how is that affecting then our ability to tailor or to do more or differently? R for responsive, and this is, I think, one that we'll talk to, and I'll talk about in a few minutes in terms of the pandemic experience and the pandemic response. What are we seeing? What does it mean? And then finally the E in terms of effectiveness. I mean, both of resources, but making sure that we've got approaches that are efficient and effective, and that are utilizing partnerships and really shared resources. So that's the approach. And I think one other little bit that I'll mention is through that 2019 call, we did try to, and we did aim to include new strategic investments around areas like mental health, like new supports to support regionalization and attraction and retention of newcomers in smaller centers. We looked at the vitality and promoting the vitality of Francophone minority communities, but also initiatives around recognition and fostering connections between newcomers and Indigenous peoples. So all of these investments are made in recognition, really, that the settlement landscape's become more complex, of course, and you live it. We all live it. But as Canada welcomes new and more diverse cohorts of immigrants, we see a change and an evolution of needs as well. So I'm going to move in terms of the impact of the pandemic. This is one where, I mean, we've shared a bit of and I know not to simplify, but I think I'm going to go in the interest of time. Maybe just the only points I'd make here are it is really around efforts to make sure that the hardest hit populations, that there was an awareness, and B, that client-centered approach, just to sort of recognize. And I think, again, Kathy provided some excellent examples of just the new challenges of dealing with, let's say, newcomer women, and the effort and the challenge of balancing competing and childcare responsibilities due to and thanks to school closures and the impacts that not being able to deliver the services or activities or a lot of the community connection kind of things that we do that we offer. So sort of recognizing the differential sometimes impacts that the change in service, sort of in the change in just lockdowns and service delivery meant, but also the fact that newcomer populations, and some of them in particular, face heightened challenges. And we talked about some of the increased challenges that refugees face, requiring often a lot more in-person services than maybe other groups comparatively. So as the pandemic worsened, the settlement sector played a critical role in providing a lot of the appropriate supports and the necessary supports to newcomers. And this is really where I've switched on to slide 4 now. And I think, Kathy, you expressed this eloquently. I mean, I think that it's that pivot, right? And we talk about the pivot to online and remote delivery from one day to the next. I think across the country, as we were partners in this, nobody really had a playbook. So we learned quickly through trying to address these things with flexibilities, administrative flexibilities. I think the lessons that we learned in terms of the partnership, but also the open, early, and often in terms of communication, to try to identify these gaps and be able to identify solutions as soon as we could. So then we get to a sense of where do we go from here? And it's a bit of the sort of trying to assess. We've all mentioned we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but we know that the pandemic's impacted the settlement sector, and it's heightened economic and social integration barriers for our clients. I mean, I think again, Kathy's reflections on what this has meant for sector staff, we can have the same reflection as public servants as what it's meant for our staffs and our teams. So it's a bit of a take stock. Where are we and where do we go? But meanwhile, I think the successful integration and the settlement work that we're doing is critical to maintaining. Well, it's critical to maintaining the resilience of newcomers and ensuring the supports are there. But to Keith's presentation earlier, it's critical to maintaining public support for levels of immigration that we expect are going to continue to remain fairly high and that are needed for economic growth. So in that context, the timing is right to take a bit of stock and explore how our experience through the pandemic sort of sets us up for a bit of that, some of the questions and the reflections. We've adapted to numerous new challenges in 2019, and we have been for decades. But we've observed, and I think this is the chance to sort of say, all right, what's something that we really want to leverage, and what are things that we want to take a bit of a cold, sober second thought approach to, in terms of what we're learning and what this experience of the last couple of years has meant. So I'll point to 3 on digital service delivery, and I think I won't repeat or belabor anything that Kathy has sort of mentioned as well. I think we saw and we learned that many clients have been, that pivot, forced as it was, I think did show us a lot of things. As you mentioned, sort of it eliminated geography in terms of a delivery barrier. It could make it easier for some clients to access in the spirit of the core principles I mentioned. Some clients may actually, it may ease some barriers. It may give them more choice or more approaches. However, and I think this is the important however, like we do see digital literacy barriers, official language barriers, accessibility barriers that we don't want to sort of jump across and say it's not a panacea. So looking ahead, I think it may be the case that some services that were previously offered only in person may be better suited. And I think that's the assessment that we need to do together. What could be better suited to online or hybrid delivery, and make sure that we assess how to support these changes. I think the work, and I'll refer to the work that we've been doing through the National Settlement and Integration Council Technology Task Group. I think there's been a couple of sessions earlier during the conference, sort of trying to dig into it in some panels. But I think that will inform us, and I think it's a good space to continue to further explore these delivery tools, as you mentioned, and opportunities to think through what that means from an accessibility, but also an outcomes perspective. The second area of reflection is around anti-racism. I think we've seen the last 2 years really crucial in understanding, and we're reminding us also of how important it is to incorporate that lens as well as an intersectional lens in all that we do, from the perspective also of the clients and who's been disproportionately marginalized or faced new barriers. Clients who have unique characteristics, whether they're demographic or group membership or social context, we need to consider how the interactions between these variables impact settlement integration, and how and where they should inform changes to the programming and the programming priorities. So I think a good opportunity and sort of a shout out to colleagues there is a good session, I think, coming at 3 on some of that work that we're doing in the collaboration on anti-racism. And third, in terms of what are the lessons we're learning, I think on measuring outcomes. And I think this is one where, as we work with the settlement sector and our delivery partners in new ways to deliver in more targeted, sometimes more client-centered services, having a strong understanding of what works best, and maybe what works not as well, will be critical to sort of advancing our sense of where to go from now. And a lot of this, I think, I'm onto my slide 7, builds on then a number of efforts and work that we're doing collectively already, or either already or we know we need to keep doing in terms of improving those services. And I'll highlight a few. The first is really around the work we've been doing on settlement outcomes. So in the summer, we released the first ever settlement outcomes highlight report that gives a bit of an analysis and summary of the immigrant experience in Canada, focusing especially on the use of settlement services over the last 4 or 5 years. But the report draws attention, I think this is important from the policy perspective, definitely, in terms of showing us areas where we can and we should be improving. And this could be areas of awareness, sort of areas related to awareness of services and uptake of newcomers. But again, it's around that tailoring of services to address barriers. A second area where there is, I think, a very active kind of reflection happening is around service delivery improvement. So we've had, part of the IRCC's innovation efforts since 2018 have been these service delivery improvement projects that give us insight into delivery approaches, models, and as we move into the next round of these delivery improvement projects, we're looking especially, and I think very timely for the conversation we've had, around ways to improve digital delivery, ways to increase employer engagement, and building more capacity in the settlement sector, including in ways to target anti-racism and exploring anti-racism capacity. And finally, the third piece we're working here is around getting better race disaggregated and race-based data through the Newcomer Outcomes Survey, which will give us a good sense again of knowing whom we're not targeting, or who we're targeting properly, and be able to address the service delivery too. All right. So this is I'm on to my last slide, and I think really here to conclude, I think we've seen through the remarkable response that we've had together The responsive settlement sector, you see the pivot to new delivery models and approaches, I think have despite the challenge, we've risen, I think everybody's risen to the task of meeting evolving client needs. And I think, this is where it's set. I think the foundation is strong in terms of meeting as immigration priorities continue to evolve. The settlement sector and the program continues to adapt as we've had in the past. And I think it's that partnership with the settlement sector that's been key to our collective success, not just over the last 2 years of the pandemic, but over the decades that we've worked together to support newcomers in their journey. So there it is. Carolyn, I think I did it. Over to you.
You guys have all been doing amazing. There's so much to cover here, and we are actually just a little bit over time. So unfortunately, I don't think we'll have time for questions. Rather than do all of our presenters a disservice and put something out there that doesn't have the time for a fulsome response. But I do thank everyone who put some questions into the chat box. And I've shared those with the presenters as well. So once again, I'd like to thank Keith, Patricia, Kathy, and David, and all of you who chose to attend this session today. There is another session following this, so that's why we unfortunately have to wrap at this moment. But we'll be envisioning the future of settlement and integration in Canada in a post-pandemic era for some time to come, I believe. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.